And our featured speaker is Victoria Cargill, who's the Associate Director of Interdisciplinary Research at the Office of Research on Women's Health. She's not able to join us, but we managed to set this up with help from our IT and their IT support. And I will actually turn the slides over to her.
So she's joining remotely, but couldn't be here in person, but we should be able to have an interactive discussion as planned.
Okay, it's over to you, Dr. Cargill.
All right, thank you very much. There we go. I'm really happy to be able to join you. I'm sorry that I could not join you in person, but as you know, the government is undergoing some changes, so this is going to be our next best option. And I'm delighted that I can actually talk to you about the sex as a biological variable, and it is challenging, and I thank Esther for pointing out some of these examples, and as we go forward, I think we'll see more. But there really is a good, better, and best to this story. So I have no financial disclosures to make, and I'm not discussing anything off-label. So let's get right to it. And one of the reasons for this, I think it helps to understand where did this come from, because it can feel like it kind of was like a bomb that dropped out of the sky. But it's a reminder to all of us, which we know intuitively and scientifically, but we may not carry it forward. And I think that term muscle memory was a very apt one, that our cells from the time of fertilization have a genetic sex assigned to the individual, and there have been not only recent data but ongoing data that demonstrates that the genes expressed on these sex chromosomes really do have a profound effect across the organism, from the biology of those cells, as different as and diverse as renal cells, to neurons and everything in between. Even more recently and exciting is the fact that we now understand how chromosomes can actually go ahead and talk to each other through proteins. So for example, in those individuals that have two X chromosomes, such as an XX, which would be a genotypic female, or an XXY, which would be a Klinefelter individual, when there is more than one X, it has now been very well demonstrated that the other X will develop a protein and actually manufacture it that will suppress the other X so that you don't get, if you will, quote-unquote, double dosing. I'd also point out that for those who have an X and a Y, you also have that capacity because the SRY gene, which we now appreciate, triggers a whole cascade of other gene proteins to then develop the individual into phenotypic biologic sex of a male. And this all really came together in a 2001 Institute of Medicine report outlining really the critical importance of these biological variables. And as we go forward, I think I'll be able to express this further. So as part of rigor and reproducibility, which was also part of a National Institute of Health notice, it's important to take stock of the fact that we must pay attention to these differences, because if we do what we call here default biology, in quotes, that we can actually cause harm and miss opportunities to develop better health for not just women, but for men and women. And Maya Duesenberg has written this book, Doing Harm, which I've shown you here in the upper left corner. In addition, considering the impact of sex and gender not only helps inform appropriate individualized care for women, but also for men. And finally, I think that sex and gender research extends far beyond reproductive health. We refer to that here when we talk about women's health. Very often we have to remind people we're not talking about bikini medicine, but we're talking about all of the organ systems involved. So this is the notice. You've seen it before, but I just want to point out and highlight a couple of things. It's improving the health outcomes of men and women through support of rigorous science, and also that this focuses on NIH's expectation, that's the underline there, expectation, that scientists will account for the possible role, possible, we didn't say it had to be there, but there's a possible role. If you don't look, you don't find. And I'll show you a couple of examples in drugs as we go forward. The possible role of sex as a biological variable in vertebrate, animal, and human studies. There really are 4 C's to make it easy to remember of studying sex to strengthen science. First of all, you have to consider it. If you don't think about it, then one doesn't design a study or even look at it. So designing studies that take sex into account or explain why it isn't incorporated. Then there's the C of collect, to tabulate sex-based data. There's the C of characterize, to analyze and take a look at sex-based data. And then finally the C, which is to communicate, to report and publish sex-based data. because sex and gender are different. And I know that we all know this intellectually and we understand it, but even as recently as last night, I was looking at a paper, and the title of the paper was The Effect of Gender on the Outcomes in Renal. No, it isn't gender you're looking at biologic sex. So even in the titles of some of these journals, for individuals publishing who very clearly understand the difference between sex and gender, they become conflated, and that's one of the things we don't want to do. So it's a reminder that, as I mentioned, every cell has a sex. Sex begins in utero. Sex affects behavior and perception, and this has been demonstrated repeatedly. Gender, however, also affects behavior and perception, and that when we're talking about sex, we're talking about genetic, molecular, cellular, physiological, and feminine, masculine. Those are gender, behavioral, environmental, sociocultural. And I would just remind us all that gender includes cisgender, which is a gender that matches your phenotypic sex, transgender, as well as intersex. So this is all well and good, but what does it mean when we say consider sex as a biological variable? Well, it depends on what side of the divide you're on, if you're on the applicant side or on the reviewer side. So if you're on the applicant side, it means explaining how relevant biological variables such as sex are factored into the research design you're proposing for the NIH to fund, and also how you're going to account for those analyses for studies in vertebrate animals and humans. And for example, you would need to provide a strong justification from the scientific literature, preliminary data, or some other relevant consideration as to why you would propose to study only one sex. So for example, if it's an application looking at prostate cancer, that's pretty straightforward and easy, because unless I've missed something in medical school, women don't have prostate. But in other examples, such as I'm studying pregnancy, and we see that someone will say, well, I'm studying pregnancy and only women get pregnant. That's a little more nuanced. Because if your study is going to look at pregnancy and its effect on a family unit, the exclusion of males in that case would not be appropriate. Reviewers are asked to consider, have the investigators presented adequate plans? They don't have to be perfect, but adequate plans to address relevant biological variables such as sex for the studies of vertebrate animals and human subjects. So to translate or operationalize this, it means review of the available literature, formulation of research questions, incorporating, when appropriate, both males and females, and if not appropriate, articulating an extremely strong justification for a single-sex study, and to make sure you incorporate the consideration of the influence of sex in the study design. It also means that there may be stratified randomization of males and females into experimental conditions, certainly characterizing the study results for males and females, as well as examination of treatment and toxicity effects for each sex separately. And I'm going to show you an example later on about how that wasn't done until the drug was well out of the barn and a fair amount of harm had been done. Consideration of the influence of sex in the interpretation of study results, and certainly the appropriate generalization of research findings. Now, as Esther has alluded to, there has been, I would say, a bit of pushback from the biomedical community, and these are some of the things that we have heard. I have scarce resources, so I can't afford to do it. Gee, I'm really only looking at early stage cells like embryos. Do I have to identify the sex? If I'm transparent that I intend to only use one sex, isn't that good enough? Not necessarily. And the NIH should admit that if we have to do this, it's going to increase our budgets by, and you can fill in the X. We just put in 2 in this example, 2X. Some have suggested more. So I think it's worth taking a look at some of these questions. And I don't want to sound like I am insensitive or inured to this. I was an R1 investigator before I came to the NIH. I am very creative at budgets. I can squeeze that buffalo until it cries like everybody else. But you know, there is something that has to be said for being able to do the work that the public health depends upon, and more importantly, the public trust in our results. Because if you have not been aware, and I'm sure you are, increasingly we get pushbacks. I see it in my clinical practice. We read about it in newspapers where, oh, First Science said this, now they said this, so you guys don't know what you're talking about, and that's even more damaging. So here are a couple of responses to some of these concerns. If I am transparent in using one sex, is that SABV? No, Virginia, it is not. If the health issue or condition pertains to one sex, then certainly, and as the example I gave to you before, prostate cancer, then yes, it would be appropriate, and that's a fairly straightforward and easy justification. But as I mentioned, pregnancy, on the face of it, would seem to be, yes, it's only going to be women, but it depends upon the study of pregnancy. If it's the impact of pregnancy upon women, then obviously it's pregnancy in women, it's a single-sex study. But if you're looking at the impact of pregnancy upon a family unit, then excluding men would be inappropriate. Another question that we are often asked, or people will use as justification, is, I simply cannot recruit, retain, engage enough women, so reporting differences is bad science. Well, there's a difference between presenting differences between men and women as statistically significant, which obviously you would not do if you did not have enough numbers, as opposed to just characterizing your observations. But to simply ignore it really is bad science. And I want to give an example from my own personal experience when I was an R1 funded investigator and practicing in the clinical trials unit. It was very interesting that in one of our protocols, one of the investigators that we were collaborating with said, well, I don't see any reason to include women because I simply can't recruit any. And we asked him to unravel that a little bit for us because at our site we didn't have difficulty recruiting women. Well, it turned out he was advertising, as he had always done, his research studies in HIV in gay newspapers. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not going to be the best venue to be able to attract women if you're putting your ads for your protocol in newspapers that target a population of men who have sex with men. And so, again, it's a matter of how hard are we trying sometimes. This one we often hear. Using SABV will mean my budget has to increase and it's too expensive. There are a couple of responses to this. First of all, we're not going to tell an investigator how to design their budget. But most of us who do this work have been funded investigators and understand how to create a budget so that the budget really should reflect what's necessary to conduct good science. If it's going to be a budget that's going to be above the cutoff, that is a discussion with the program officer. That mechanism is in place. And before I gave this presentation, I picked up my telephone and called two of my handy-dandy favorite program officers, and their response was, as I would expect. If someone is going to incorporate sex as a biological variable as we require, and they think it's going to inflate their budget beyond the cutoff, they need to talk to us so we can talk that through with them. Second, and I think this is very important, there is no excuse to waste dollars, which are becoming increasingly tight, we're on studies that don't consider sex differences, and then we have to turn around and either redo the study because the phase 4 post-marketing surveillance data or other findings indicate there's a problem or a toxicity, and now we've got to redo it. And this is where I think we really have to be very honest. This is very damaging. It damages not only the belief in our science, it damages not only the public trust, but we're wasting money. We just threw a whole bunch of money down a rat hole and have to do it again. And then the last, which is one that our colleagues at FDA are very fond of, is I've never seen any evidence of a difference. And one of my colleagues has a saying that is, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And it's a lovely play on words, but it's true. Just because you don't have that evidence doesn't mean there's nothing there. And nevirapine is the example. It was in my earlier slides, but I see it's come out, that I'm going to take a minute to talk about. As an HIV provider, I had the opportunity to care for a young woman who was highly disengaged from care, repeatedly non-adherent, and as I was transitioning to come here, I switched her to nevirapine. Nevirapine, if you're not an HIV provider, I remind you, was licensed in 1996. But I was one of those who reported the adverse reaction of toxic epidermal necrolysis. And those of you who have seen TEN know if you've seen it once, you never want to see it again in life. And this young woman at the age of 26, after having successfully delivered an HIV-negative infant, was placed on nevirapine based upon the current data that we had in 1998. In 1998, she developed toxic epidermal necrolysis, was admitted to the intensive care unit, and stayed there for 4 months, surviving 3 bouts of polymicrobial sepsis. And I know how long she was there because I spent some of the time sleeping on the floor next to her bed. However, in 2000, this happened in 98, 2000 was when the black box warning was issued. But it wasn't until 2001 when Bill Powderly and his colleagues at the University of Washington actually went back and examined the data of all the clinical trials of nevirapine, which, by the way, were 85% male, and despite that, women still had 7 times the risk of men of developing toxic epidermal necrolysis or fulminant hepatic necrosis. This is data hiding in plain sight. So failing to look at the difference or even characterizing the difference can lead to true harm. So with applications and review, and you see on the left-hand side the element of rigor, I just want you to see that under scientific rigor comes consideration of relevant biological variables such as sex, and it's part of the research strategy, and it is felt to be important because it contributes to the overall impact of the project. So I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much for that. We wanted to just pause for a second and see if there's any questions for Dr. Cargill at this point.
I think one of the advantages of this session is we wanted to make it more interactive based on examples of questions you might have, having Dr. Cargill here to be able to answer it from NIH review perspective. We will be including some examples, like a clinical example, a preclinical example, and a kind of a population policy kind of an example, just to see how you translate the interpretation of this policy into your actual grants. So we will look at that, but if you have any personal examples or questions, please feel free to ask at any point. I'm going to repeat the question for Dr. Cargill. So.
I'm Kelly O'Loughlin. I'm a researcher at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I study health interventions for refugees in Uganda. One study that I'm working on, that I'm developing, that I have not received grant funding for yet, is to study HIV test and treat intervention for people who sell sex for money in the refugee settlement. I'm curious what advice you would have for me there. In this setting, most of the people who are selling sex for money that we're aware of are women, although there are some men. And I don't know if you have input on what the most appropriate design, and I know I'm not giving you a ton of details to work off of, but the population I was thinking of targeting were women, but I obviously want to address this carefully.
So, I actually heard the question. So is it okay if I go ahead and respond?
Yes.
First of all, it sounds like a very interesting study. I do think that there are several ways to approach this. You mentioned that although the bulk of the individuals who are engaging in what I'll just shorthand call commercial sex work are women, there are some men. So there would be several ways I would think that you could consider this. First of all, you could focus on the women, but include men as a subset or a small sample with whom you were going to try and do either the same intervention. I'm sorry, I don't remember if you were doing an intervention or just first just studying them. So that would be one way to do it. I think it's important in your background and significance to provide as much background as possible so the person reviewing your application understands and really has a mental picture of your population, because they're not there. So being able to say, as you shared with me, that the bulk of the individuals who are engaging in this behavior are female. However, we know there are males, and if you give them some reference, such as 70-30 or 80-20, that would be helpful. But that would be one way to approach it. And then, again, remembering that we're not saying with sex is a biological variable. You have to have equal numbers of men and women. What we're saying is you have to include them. So if you had them as either a nested subset or a small pilot group that you're looking at to see if there are going to be any differences, you can report it as such, and no one's asking you to report statistics, but you're at least saying, gee, it turns out in both populations this approach to testing works, or it appears that in men, because there's perhaps so few, or perhaps because it's stigmatized, for whatever reason, but it warrants further exploration, there was a difference. And that's where the benefit comes in. I hope that's helpful.
Can I ask a question? So just to add to that, as an extension, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, well, is it adequate to match the prevalence or incidence of a disease. So if most of the sex workers in your population are women, you had a great explanation of how to approach that. But say, for instance, you want to test a medication for gout, and 9 out of 10 people are men who have gout. Do you enroll 90% men and 10% women to match that? Because I've always had the feeling that those few women should be treated with medication that's designed and perfected for them, and not necessarily, that's where the matching the incidence and prevalence wouldn't be beneficial. I'm wondering if you get that question a lot.
I did hear the question, and yes, we do get it, and I guess I have a couple of responses. Because part of the response is what you said at the end of your question. Yes, 90% of the individuals who present, I'm presuming you're talking about tophaceous gout, are men and 10% are women. However, the reason to still include the women is to make sure that the potential differences or outcomes, or even if there's a signal, as our colleagues like to call, is present. Because you just finished saying you think that women should have treatments that are more appropriate for them, but I would counter and say we can't get those treatments that are more appropriate for them if we don't put them in the study. So we're kind of then into tautologous reasoning. So it would make sense to include women so that we can begin to take a look at this, because unfortunately the graveyard of drugs is littered with examples that have gone there, particularly because the bulk of the time, no one either looked at women or thought women were different, and when the phase 4 surveillance data was looked at, the difference was so profound the drug had to hit the trash.
And I might add to that specific question, for instance, and an example is cardiovascular disease, which certainly in the younger age is more common in men as compared to women. And so NIH funded a study called Virgo study, which was, PI was out of Yale, but it was 170 sites looking at young men and women with MI less than 55 years of age. And the enrollment strategy for that, because we were very specifically looking at sex differences, was a 2:1 enrollment ratio. So 2 women for 1 man. And so it was designed to be that. It was a very expensive study. And so NIH had to be convinced that it was important, but it gave us very different information from all the other studies, which are large national registries of millions of MI patients, because most of them include older men and women.
That's an excellent example.
It was in okay.
So why don't we move on? So Bosma will be going over a number of examples. No, I have control. I just wanted to show you from how the reviewers are instructed. So from their perspective, they receive this guidance, and this is on the NIH website. The first question is, and they just take it straight through an algorithm. So the first question is, does the study involve vertebrate animals or humans? So if yes, they move on to, is the study intended specifically to test for sex differences? In other words, is that the point of the study? And if the answer is yes, then they then ask, is the design analysis adequately rigorous to test for those sex differences that it is proposing to study? And if it is yes, then they will acknowledge that as a strength in the critique and discussion and score accordingly. So that is supposed to be really like a checkbox on their way to assessing an overall score. And if no, obviously it'll be acknowledged specifically as a weakness. So this is just kind of drawing out that this really should be one of their criteria for the rigor of your study design now. And if it's not intended to test for sex differences, and this will be the vast majority of the research projects that we put in, then they'll just simply ask, are both sexes included in the study? And if no, then we end up in sort of this algorithm, and they'll look for your justification of including only one sex in the study and consider whether or not your justification is solid. And if not, they'll acknowledge it as a weakness. If yes, then they should acknowledge that as a strength in the study. If both sexes are included, then the question for them is, does the proposal demonstrate plans to report data disaggregated by sex, which happens less often than you would think. And Bosma and actually all of us are involved in a study looking at the emergency medicine literature and seeing how often the simple step of just reporting data disaggregated by sex happens, and it is increasing, but certainly not quite there yet. And then again, that should be a criteria for them to gauge weakness or strength of the study. All right, so pretty straightforward, but that's the guidance that the reviewers are getting on the NIH side.
Great. So I thought we can do some examples of, what does it mean in preparing your own research. And I think it's worth it also because in preparation for this talk, I emailed, people I know who are doing human research and NIH research, and asked them for examples in their grants if they ever had a comment about it or had questions or were questions about it. And 90% of the people, and this is like disaster medicine, toxicology, cardiovascular, neurological, and 90% of the responses was, this is not relevant to my research. So I think we don't think about it, but NIH, that is what NIH is trying to do, to make, if you don't think this is relevant and you're doing human research, to make you think. And so let's look at some examples of what that means. So I'm going to actually, for the first example, I'm going to have Vicky, turn it back to Vicky because she is, this is a preclinical example, and this is borrowed from her. So do you want to?
Sure. So this is one that came up in one of our recent reviews. The Office of Research in Women's Health does have a process by which an individual can, in fact, go ahead and, I'm going to stop for a minute because I cannot resume control here for some reason. I'm sorry. We got it.
Okay.
Thank you. We have a supplement that we provide to individuals who look at their work and come back and say, gee, I realized there was a problem or I didn't include it. And this is one that stood out for me because it was in my first couple of months being here. And this is an investigator that came from a Midwestern university. And I was actually fascinated by this study because in response to chemotherapies and chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, a study had been done of male rats, and this investigator was very transparent in his application. He said it worked very well. They were able to use this protein and never even thought, the quote was, we never even thought that we should worry about the sex of the rat. But when they wanted to move forward on this protein to make sure that it was appropriate, they went back and tried to do a proof of concept using this very same protein and using it on male rats and female rats. And the reason he came to the ORWH for supplemental funding to start to redo all of his basic work was because in the female rats, not only was it ineffective, it made them worse. They had protracted vomiting to the point of dehydration and death. So obviously that's not going to go very far. So this is why we propose again that individuals really consider this, because even if something is basic rats, it doesn't matter. Rat is a rat is a rat. No, that's not true.
Great.
I don't know if you want me to go to this next one.
Yes, please.
Okay. I don't have. Yes. All right. This is from a little near and dear to my heart in a way because I am an HIV provider. But if one goes through the pre-exposure prophylaxis literature, it's been, especially early on, very heavily conducted in men who have sex with men for reasons that clearly make sense because of the trajectory of the epidemic in that population. Nevertheless, as pre-exposure prophylaxis has gained popularity, the studies in women have continued to lag behind. So Auerbach and colleagues did a very straightforward study of women in urban settings with identifiable risk behaviors that would place them at levels of risk either similar to or in some cases exceeding that of their men who have sex with men counterparts. And they found that over 3/4 of the women had never even heard of pre-exposure prophylaxis, had no idea what it was. And yet you're talking about women with comparable levels of risk. And moreover, when they probed, discovered through focus group and through motivational interviewing, these women would not only be receptive to such an intervention, but many were very distressed that they had never even been approached about a product for use in them. And so again, the result is that this is a missed opportunity to not only include some high-risk individuals who would benefit, but we've now lost time in understanding some of the context and the nuances around not a sex, but a gender using a product to prevent transmission.
Okay, I'll take it back. Thank you so much, Vicki.
Sure.
So for the next example, this is a clinical example, and I decided to use my own work, which is on coronary microvascular disease, primarily because when we think about research and the role of SABV and how it's used or not used, we think, and we know historically that most of those conditions have been studied in male rats or in men. Coronary microvascular disease is something that is more prevalent in women, and the biggest study that came out in a 80 to 20% ratio or 70 to 30% ratio. So unlike other studies, it has primarily been studied in women only. And so we don't know too much about what happens in the course of women and what happens in men specifically when they do have it, because, you know, does atherosclerosis progress differently in men or not? So I think we did the disease a disservice by including only women at that time. And that was a big WISE study that came out about 10 years ago and was a big study funded by NHLBI. And two smaller studies that have looked at it subsequent have also looked at only women. So this was a grant that I was looking at an RCT on coronary microvascular disease that was diagnosed in the emergency department. And because it's a disease that is not as prevalent as coronary artery disease, it takes longer to enroll patients. So I could not make it as, I wanted to look at sex differences, include both men and women, but it did not have enough time or the funding or the budget to look at it as a primary hypothesis or the secondary hypothesis. But I decided to include it in the study design by, one, acknowledging the prevalence and the fact that we're going to enroll both men and women. And then by including it in the study design, looking at the heterogeneity in the treatment effects, looking at sex by inclusion simply as descriptive data, exploratory descriptive data, not as primary or secondary hypotheses. And adjusting the models for age, sex, and depression with the understanding that the data that we're going to get out of it will serve as exploratory data. If we see some different, if we see a signal, we can submit something for a sex-specific study. And that was sufficient for the reviewers. So it's really about understanding the subject population that you're studying and somehow thinking about what is the best possible way you can study that and include in the grant. Now, I'll now move on to another example. This is from one of my colleagues, and it's a typical example. It's a colleague who was looking at IT technology for screening of falls in elderly patients. So human subjects were involved, and they figured, it's primarily an informatics grant, but it was going to the NIH, and they figured they had 60% women in the study design, so that should check that box. The reviewers said no, there's no mention of acknowledging the sex and gender in the analysis plan, even though you have equal enrollment of men and women. So they sent it back and said that's not addressed. So in the second attempt, all they did was they said we will look at differences of the same outcomes they're looking at it, but by sex and gender, and this time it went through. So I think NIH is just attempting to have us think about sex and gender in whatever research we're doing, and not necessarily entirely change the design of what we're doing. And Dr. Cargill, I will let you expand on that.
I think that you raised a very good point. As we've said repeatedly, especially in response to concerns expressed that you're trying to change our research or tell us how to do the research. No, what we're trying to get you to do is to think about whether it's a cell or an organ or an organism, that there may be a sex difference, and it is important to explore that, because even if there are small numbers, but there is a small signal, as you had indicated, that could be enough that this is a pilot to justify going forward to take a look to explore this difference, to see if this difference is in fact real and the magnitude of the difference. And to that end, because it is so important, the Office of Research on Women's Health has several different ways for investigators who may have begun to work in an area but realized that there was a sex difference that they hadn't attended to, or as in the case of the investigator that I gave as the example in basic science, and by the way, I've now reviewed many of these grants, and it's been interesting to see the same theme repeated over and over and over again. The females behaved differently. It wasn't effective in females. Females had higher toxicity. Well, obviously this is going to be essential if you're hoping to move from concept into actual intervention. So we have what's called the Sex and Gender Administrative Supplement. It's announced in the guide. I don't recall the funding caps offhand, but this is an administrative supplement that someone already has an existing NIH grant, and they go back and they realize, you know, I think I could do a better job of looking at sex and gender differences. This is a perfect administrative supplement for someone to apply for. It is reviewed both at the institute level for the science as well as at the Office of Research and Women's Health level to look at the inclusion of sex as a biological variable. The second is the U3 administrative supplement, which is not specifically targeted to sex, a biological difference. That is our understudied, underrepresented, and underreported women administrative supplement. I actually lead this one. But the idea is to take a look at women in a range of circumstances, socioeconomic status, social determinants of health, as well as cisgender, transgender, intersex, so that, again, if there are signals or concerns that were looked at in men, this can be looked at in this population. And this, again, has to be tied to a parent grant that is funded through the NIH. The last is what's called the SRP, or Supplemental Research Funding, and that is something that's done at the level of the institute. This is where the investigator would work with their institute, either because they either just missed the funding pay line or because they were able to address the concerns that were raised in the review but have now missed the review target, that could this be moved forward instead through SRP funding. And there are 3 rounds of this as money permits. And this is done, again, this is where the one that's different, where the institute actually proposes the application. But the investigator can then speak to the institute, their program officer. And again, this is why I would strongly encourage, as people begin to get used to this sex as a biological variable concept and include it in the application, talk to the program officer. They would much rather talk to you on the front end than sit in a review and have to explain to you why you're going to need 12 units before you can read that summary sheet on the back end. So I'll turn it back to you.
That was very helpful, Dr. Cargill. Can you just elaborate on the process of getting the supplemental funding? Do you, like, if there's an investigator, do they need to already have research funded by one of the institutions before they come to you?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't make that clear. For an administrative supplement, the whole notion of the administrative supplement is someone is returning to the NIH who already has an existing what's called parent grant at the NIH through one of the institutes. The institute needs to be participating in the administrative supplement. In the case of the Sex and Gender Administrative Supplement, that is not a concern. All of the institutes participate in the Sex and Gender Administrative Supplement. For the U3 Administrative Supplement, because it is much newer, this is the second year, approximately half of the institutes participate. But I can tell you that when we first announced this administrative supplement, 3 investigators wrote to me and said, this is something I'd like to pursue because I'm seeing a signal in men and I've never really thought about this in women. And because they were so committed to trying to do this, they contacted the project officer. The project officer contacted us and signed on, what's called signing on, so that then they could apply. But yes, for an administrative supplement, the investigator needs to have a parent application that is funded by the National Institutes of Health. In the case of the SRP funding, that is done at the institute level. And so sometimes those applications are ones that didn't meet the pay line, but the project officer feels that in working with the investigator, this could be moved forward and they will then bring it to ORWH. I hope that.
Well, that sounds great.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the awareness we need to spread through our specialty is like everyone who has bodies of data sitting there and they've never looked at this question. One of the compelling reasons for looking, simply looking, is if you see a signal. And I think a lot of people assume, I'm familiar with this area, I've never seen any gender things. Nobody's ever talked about sex or gender things, or I'm underpowered to look at that.
Or used as a control variable.
Or yeah, and I think this is inspiring because you look there, you see a signal. We're talking about hard money they could go after that could really sustain their research for longer in these lean money times. So I think that's a huge impetus for us.
One additional resource, and Vicki, you might be able to talk about this, is the online course series that the NIH offers through the Office of Research and Women's Health. It's the Science of Sex and Gender in Human Health, and it's very Googleable if you want to take a look. There are 3 online courses, and you can obtain credit. I know that you're in the process of updating those modules, and I'm getting some expert opinion on that. So the credit is not available right now, but I have done these modules just, about 6 months ago or so, and they have it on basic science, health and behavior, and disease expression and treatment. And so you can get some really sort of education on just how to consider this in research and practice.
Thank you for raising that. Yes, that's a great course. As you mentioned, it is offline right now because they're actively working on it and updating it, including updating all the references. So one of the things I think is nice about this course is besides having your awareness increased about this, you actually are given a very robust bibliography of references that you can go through. So right now, again, it's being rewritten, it's being updated, additional references are being examined, and we are also adding new sections, and then it will come back online. So thank you.
Are there any questions?
Hi, I just have a couple questions. So I'm Lane Coffey from Indiana University, and I'm a PhD by training, and so it's been a bit since I've been in the lab, and I've moved into more clinical work now, but I have a couple points and questions. Do you, sorry, oh, yeah, thanks. Do you think that at some point invertebrate animals might be included in this, specifically Drosophila? Because back in the day I worked on Drosophila, and actually at the time we just sort of grouped males and females. But do you think that it may come in a couple years that, there could be requirements for invertebrate animals such as this?
Did you hear the question?
Was that about invertebrate animals? And I heard that in the Drosophila.
Yeah, specifically Drosophila, right?
Right now, there has not been any move toward invertebrate animals. I almost fear that if we were to start talking about invertebrate animals, we might all worry about being axe murdered. But right now, we don't have any plans to look at invertebrate animals. We're trying to push forward with vertebrate and humans. But I, in my past life in college, did research on Drosophila melanogaster and would agree with you that there are sex differences there that are not appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely, because, so I worked on Fragile X syndrome, and we worked on behavioral models, and so obviously that phenocopies the human disease quite well, and I even thought that there, without getting into any numbers and data, that there were specifically differences between males and females. So the other question I have is, are you seeing investigators report in applications whether they're using virgin females versus mated females? Because there is a body of literature that suggests that if mated mice and rats, female mice and rats are mated versus haven't been mated in the past, that they do have different behavioral phenotypes. So are you seeing applicants sort of say, okay, I'm using virgin versus not, or which just adds to more complexity.
Virgin females versus mated versus unmated females. I'll look at it that way. Yeah. It really would depend on the area. In terms of basic work, more in our behavioral sciences, we'll see that from our colleagues. But for example, in the area where I spend more of my research clinical time, which would be in HIV infection, we have not looked at that as much, except as when you're looking at mating females in the context of transmission of SHIV.
There's nothing wrong with ending 3 minutes too early. So thank you all for your attention, and in particular, thanks to Dr. Cargill for joining us and giving us the information.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vicki.
Thank you. Enjoy your meeting.
This was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So glad you were here to answer some of these tough questions.
We could not have
They
waited
are
this.
tough, but they're fair. I mean, that's fair. And actually, the invertebrate and the mated versus unmated females, I'm going to actually take to Dr. Clayton and ask her if we want to start to look more into that area.
Okay. If you hear, let us know, and we'll pass it along.
All right. I will. Thank you.
Thank
We'll be in
you.
touch.
And Vicki, one last thing, Vicki.
Yes.
I was just going to say, I outlined this talk. We thought we may just sort of put it into a paper form that might be nice for a publication for one of our journals. So you will hear from us to get your input if you're able to join us on that paper as an author.
All right. My only caution to you is, members of FED, it's not that we can't do papers. I've certainly published a fair amount. It's just it's always helpful to have a little lead time because it's got to go through a couple layers of clearance.
Right. Okay.
No, that makes sense.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.